Next, I want to introduce our next speaker. Mark Miller was the Libertarian Party of Texas nominee for Texas Railroad Commissioner both in 2014 and in 2016. He has also previously served as the vice chair of LP Texas, and Mark is currently enjoying his semi-retirement from his home in Dripping Springs. Everyone, please welcome Mark Miller.
Get everything set up here. I was told to limit my speech to about 45 minutes, so I've actually limited it to about 35 minutes. So if there are any questions at the end or a longer break before the gubernatorial candidates get to talk to each other, that'll be fine. Before I get around to the subject of today's talk, which is morality and politics, I'd like to first share a bit of personal background. As most of you know, my 2016 campaign for Texas Railroad Commissioner succeeded in ensuring that the Libertarian Party will be on Texas' general election ballot this year. If you thought about it at all, you probably sighed a huge sigh of relief, and you should have. Had we not squeaked past the 5% threshold, many of you in this room would be out raising money and organizing a $500,000 petition drive instead of sitting here listening to me ramble from my soapbox. But though my 2016 team has much to be proud of, everyone really should understand the serious, likely non-repeatable tailwinds that we had in 2016. Intense national interest in alternative parties, particularly poor Republican and Democratic candidates for railroad commissioner, my special qualifications for a very highly technical position, and of course our success in garnering all those major newspaper endorsements. But despite all those tailwinds, we still only got 5.3% of the vote. Yes, an important 5.3%, but 5.3% nonetheless. Many, including me, thought we might do better, but of course we didn't. So after mourning that loss of a high-paying state job, I decided it was time to embrace the life of a country gentleman and spend some time reflecting on the lessons of 2016. For this hillbilly come oil field trash, the country gentleman thing has been a little bit of a challenge. The reflections thing is going a little bit better. Anyone who's interested can find some of my thoughts on my old campaign site, Miller4tx.com. Obviously, I have some additional ones I'd like to share with you today. Let's start with something many of you won't want to hear. What if, oh crap, 5% turns out to be a ceiling rather than a floor for contested statewide races in Texas? What if that's the best alternative parties can do? In the last 25 years, LP Texas has only failed to retain ballot access once, in 2002, when Democrats ran a candidate in every statewide race, just as they did in 2016. More recently, though, Democrats failed to contest several statewide races. In 2010, there were 3 races without a Democrat on the ballot, 4 in 2012, 3 in 2014, but there were none in 2016. Part of that was some special circumstances, but there's only 1 uncontested statewide race this year. Why is that? Well, it's because Democrats are seeing an opening, even here in deep red Texas. Though Trump overwhelmingly won the small rural counties and thus the state, Clinton, by a small margin, won the large urban counties, the counties where 80% of Texas voters reside. Intense opposition to Trump, along with his abysmal approval ratings, are fomenting a lot of Democratic optimism. If you think the Republicans in the 85th legislature ended one-punch straight-ticket voting out of principle, think again. They're worried about a repeat of down-ballot losses to Democrats in the large urban counties, such as happened in 2016. And even though the one-punch option is slated to disappear in Texas in 2020, there's nothing to prevent voters from continuing to vote along tribal lines, which is what voters are already doing in the 40 states without the one-punch option. Dan Henninger, in a recent editorial in the Wall Street Journal, further added to my worries, and I quote, "Forget your political biases, which impair comprehension in direct proportion to their intensity. Clarity comes only to those willing to see all this for what it is, a crude death struggle for power." If Henninger is correct, and I suspect he is, the fight between the two duopoly giants will take no prisoners. We already saw in the last presidential election that a very large proportion of votes were cast more out of fear and loathing of the opposition than in support of their chosen candidate. And even though we had two of the most disliked major party presidential candidates in recent history, fewer than 6% of votes were cast for someone else. And then there's that recent Senate race in Alabama, where even with all the controversy and an amazing Democratic win in a very red state, fewer than 2% of votes were cast outside the duopoly. Though some are optimistic about the possibility of a coming surge in alternative party political relevancy, I'm really not so sure. Yes, there's turmoil in both major parties, but simply hoping that voters will somehow magically turn away from the duopoly could turn out to be a strategy for remaining in the political wilderness. I believe the only way in from the cold will be to engage on two simultaneous political fronts. First is to do whatever we can to weaken the structurally entrenched two-party election rules that we currently suffer under. Second is to look for new approaches to engaging voters in the political arena. With regard to the first item, there is much to be done, obviously. The Texas Voter Choice Act that was introduced in the 85th legislature as House Bill 3068 would have been a great start. This bill should be again introduced in the 86th legislature, and I hope all of you in this room will work hard and get behind the passage of this bill. But what I want to talk to you about today are some of my thoughts about the second issue, better ways to engage voters. Let me start with a personal story about the challenges. The most substantive forum I was invited to was one in Alvin, Texas, very early in 2014. It was attended by 3 of the 4 Republican candidates that year and me. It was a Tea Party event, so I'm sure Democrats running for the office didn't see much point in attending. The moderator was excellent, well informed about Railroad Commission issues. It was a great forum. Interestingly enough, out of those 3 Republicans that were on that forum, 2 of them are now sitting railroad commissioners. But anyway, back to my point, a couple of my supporters who went with me reported that I got the most positive response from the audience, by far. My positions clearly resonated with the group, even with the moderator. A couple of weeks later, they released the results of their straw poll. I came in dead last by a long shot. The wasted vote syndrome was even a problem on an unofficial ballot. So let's get back to today's topic. In my Country Gentleman Reflections after the campaign, I came across a book that has some very relevant insights for us to consider as we contemplate changes in how we engage voters. The title of the book was The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, by Jonathan Haidt. The book reports findings by Haidt and others in the field of moral psychology. Haidt's intention was to address the barriers to understanding that we seem to be erecting between ourselves and others, to get at the roots of our political polarization that has us in a seemingly endless state of war. Let me begin with 3 of his important insights. You may agree with all of these, and if so, take his work as confirming your opinion. But if you don't agree, I'd suggest you read the book along with his evidence. These insights are not based on mere conjecture. Insight number 1, though we often believe otherwise, our moral positions rapidly spring from an intuitive feeling response. Our moral sense of whether something is right or wrong comes from the gut. We just know. Contrary to what most of us think, reason is not the source of our morality. Morality comes from something deeper. Insight number 2. Moral reasoning, that is the conscious rationales for our moral positions, postdate the initial intuitive response. Groupthink, confirmation bias, and the avoidance of cognitive dissonance are all symptoms of post hoc reasoning. Most of us, as Haidt says, have very effective internal press secretaries at work. The reasoning function that rationalizes our predetermined intuitive moral positions. Haidt has many examples to show how good we are at this, even in the face of extremely convincing rational counterarguments. The last insight, the one that really I want to talk about more this afternoon, this morning, is number 3. When we do manage to change our moral positions, it is always through personal conversations and interactions, or through emotionally compelling stories. To change hearts, we must work through hearts. Battles of the moral reasoning wits just don't work. Our press secretaries are simply too good. It is only through conversation with those we trust and respect that we become open to changing our moral intuition. Our moral matrices, suggests Haidt, evolved as a means of binding people together, first in hunter-gatherer groups and then into larger settlements and civilizations, beginning with the Neolithic agricultural revolution around 10,000 years ago. The human evolutionary response to the various, often hostile environments that we came to occupy on the earth was an amazing ability to get along in inclusive and trustworthy groups. Haidt points out that among all species, again I quote, human beings are the world champions of cooperation beyond kinship. But isn't that what politics is about? Figuring out how to successfully cooperate with each other? Don't all of us just want mutually beneficial, harmonious communities for ourselves, our families, and our fellow citizens? That's certainly why I'm engaged in politics. Haidt likens our moral intuitions, those intuitive gut feelings, to an elephant. No, not a Republican elephant. A very smart elephant, but a non-reasoning beast nonetheless. He further suggests that our moral reasoning, the post hoc response to our intuition, is the elephant's rider, able to nudge the elephant at times, but mostly along for the ride. Moral intuitions and judgments are the elephant's call. Our reasoning selves were a later evolutionary addition. The rider serves the elephant, not the other way around. Even Albert Einstein recognized the power of our intuitions when he said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." Though our moral foundations are built into our fundamental human nature, cultural evolution and personal experiences mean that our moral judgments are expressed in different ways. After all, we're all different. Haidt, though, suggests that the basic fundamental moral matrices that we collectively share is made up of 6 foundations. We could argue about whether there's just 6 and certainly have some ideas of my own, but they're a really good place to start a conversation. He makes arguments in his book why these foundations were determined by evolutionary challenges. That's why they're coming from intuitions. And in the interest of time, I'll just defer that discussion for another day, but I really would suggest you read the book. Number 1, the Care-Harm Foundation, cherishing and protecting others from harm, particularly children and those who are vulnerable. 2, the Fairness Cheating Foundation, rendering justice according to shared rules, the challenge of group cooperation without getting exploited. 3, the Loyalty Betrayal Foundation, standing with your group, family, tribe, or nation to form and maintain coalitions as well as promote intra-group cohesion. 4, the Authority Subversion Foundation, submitting to tradition, legitimate authority within our social hierarchies. 5, the Sanctity Purity Foundation, feeling that some things are simply noble, pure, or even sacred, while others are base and degraded. And number 6, which I'll talk more about, which is near and dear to us libertarians, is the Liberty Oppression Foundation, freedom from coercion by those who wish to dominate us. The Care, Harm, and Fairness Cheating Foundations primarily address individual behaviors, caring for the most vulnerable among us, while guarding against the freeloader problem. The Loyalty, Betrayal, and Authority Subversion Foundations, on the other hand, focus primarily on intra-group behaviors, maintaining cohesion, mutually beneficial relationships, to reap the rewards of group support and cooperation. They're about community. Libertarians and progressives tend to place little emphasis on these last two foundations. Most on the right, however, place significant weight on all of Haidt's foundations. He presents some studies and results that suggest that the right's emphasis on a broader range of moral foundations gives them a natural advantage in politics. Haidt also suggests that libertarians and progressives tend to place little emphasis on the Sanctity Purity Foundation. I'm not quite so sure about that. Our sense of moral sanctity is expressed in so many different ways. Just listen to the appeals to God's law, natural law, the rule of law, the Constitution, or even the non-aggression principle. There certainly is an underlying transcendent quality to those appeals. The Liberty Oppression Foundation does not seem to have been well tested by Haidt or other researchers and appears in his book almost as an afterthought. He does suggest that this foundation seems to at least have been partially embraced by both on the left and right. He says, the foundation supports the egalitarianism and anti-authoritarianism of the left, as well as the don't tread on me and give me liberty anti-government anger of libertarians and some conservatives. Pertinent to our discussion today, though, Haidt suggests that libertarians care about the Liberty Oppression Foundation almost to the exclusion of all other concerns, giving it primacy in our politics. Part of the challenge we all have in reaching out to the elephants of others is how Haidt describes most of us and the people we interact with: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. The initials W-E-I-R-D, weird. He points out that even within the West, Americans are weirder than Europeans, and within the US, the educated middle class are the weirdest of all. The point of this distinction is that those of us who in fact are Western, educated, and industrialized, rich, and democratic tend to view the world as full of separate individuals rather than relationship. Consequently, the moral foundations we rely on tend to emphasize those that reflect individual autonomy. Those who are not so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic are different. They view the world through the lens of relationships, interpersonal interactions, and community. Most of the world is not weird. Modern channels of instant communication make it increasingly difficult for our political elephants to communicate with each other. In a galaxy far, far away that some of you old farts may remember, we used to disparage the sound bites of television news. We were appalled at the plethora of political discourse that was crammed into 30 to 60-second sound bites. But now, our modern avenues of communication through tweets, memes, one-line Facebook arguments make that length of time seem like an eternity. The time we seem to be allotting for even a modicum of reflection and discussion, not to mention civil discourse, seems to have evaporated. And don't get me started about the increasing number of code words that have entered our political discourse. These are words that are meant either to instantly trigger positive responses from our supporters or to ridicule the views of our opponents. Sound bites are now measured in milliseconds. The framers of the US Constitution, even as they sought to create a political system that would protect us from would-be tyrants, also understood the tyrannical dangers of mob rule, tyranny of the majority. Our Republican form of government was constructed in part to allow for more interpersonal interactions, more time to consider alternative points of view, and more time for the elephants to have their say. Though I embrace and applaud rapid, widespread modern communications, in many ways, it may be undermining productive political discourse. Our fear-driven, polarized political tribalism may be an indication that the elephants are now running amok. Reasoned arguments, unfortunately, are not likely to provide the path out of this conundrum. I'm not at all sure what is. What I do know, though, is that the instant communication toothpaste is out of the tube, and it's not going back in. Let me take a little side trip and talk about two interesting issues that have either moved or begun to move in a libertarian direction. Issues that the libertarians have been concerned with since the party's inception. That is, the legalization of same-sex marriage and the increasing public acceptance of ending marijuana prohibition. Even though in 2015 the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately declared same-sex marriages were constitutionally protected, this issue had already been working its way through state legislatures and state courts. Change was already happening. Not all that long ago, our gay and lesbian friends and family members were justifiably reluctant to publicly share their sexual preferences. Even now, homosexuality and certainly same-sex marriage violates some people's sanctity purity foundation, sometimes, though not in every case, for religious reasons. But then things began to change, initially driven by political activism, but ultimately through personal interactions. But it wasn't that people began to realize that, maybe those libertarians were right. Government really doesn't have a right to interfere in a private arrangement between consenting adults. But that's not what happened. What happened was that as increasing numbers of our LGBT friends and family had the courage to be open about their sexual preferences, the issue became personal. It was harder to demonize same-sex marriage when your dear goddaughter was lesbian or your beloved grandson was gay. It became increasingly difficult for people to oppose the happiness of people they knew and loved and cared about. By the time the Supreme Court ruling came down, it created barely a ripple. I live in Dripping Springs, which shortly before the Supreme Court ruling was declared by the Texas legislature to be the wedding capital of Texas. 7,000 weddings a year are conducted in Dripping Springs. The day after the ruling, of course, reporters headed out to the Drip to ask what some of the wedding venues thought about same-sex marriages. Their response was basically, we do weddings, what's the issue? Change happened because of all those compelling human relationships. The elephants were nudged into turning. Post hoc moral reasoning was supplied by the Supreme Court. Marijuana prohibition has a similar history. As you heard from Jax, Texas has been a little slow on the uptake, but the rest of the country is changing rapidly. Prior to the 90s, cannabis was a legally prohibited substance across the U.S. Most people, in their heart of hearts, just knew that marijuana was harmful. Evidence to the contrary was widely refuted through the moral reasoning of the times. Marijuana was viewed as the first step on the road to hell. Marijuana laws, though, began to change with the relaxation of restrictions for medical use. Why? Because there was a realization that cannabis was effective at helping people with certain medical disorders. Many states, bucking the government, began to allow marijuana as a prescription medicine. This relaxation ultimately opened the door in many states to ending the prohibition of marijuana even for recreational use. But all this didn't happen because people started saying to themselves, I think those libertarians were right. The government really does have no business telling me what I can and cannot put in my body. No, that's not what happened. Change happened because of compelling personal stories about the reduction of suffering from the use of this natural plant. Even in the 85th legislature, as you heard from Jack previously, more than half of the House signed on to a medical marijuana bill. Why? Because of that hearing that highlighted personal, compelling stories that tugged at Height's Care and Harm Foundation. Hearts were softened by messages from the heart. Before I wrap things up, I want to make a prediction that many of you won't want to hear, but I'm going to make it anyway. No Libertarian Party candidate running in a partisan race in Texas is going to get elected in 2018. Let me say it again. No Libertarian Party candidate running in a partisan race in Texas is going to get elected in 2018. Some of you running in contested races may manage to garner more than 5%. Since the base Libertarian vote is around 3%, that will be a big victory for you, your team, and your donors. Lest I get accused of being the Grinch who stole Christmas, I'm not suggesting you give up. Quite the contrary. I believe that if we're going to defang the duopoly, and that's got to be our immediate goal, we can't play by duopoly rules, but we've got to keep playing. Let's start by addressing that binary thinking that ends up as the left-right win-lose, my way or the highway, wasted vote mentality. We libertarians are just as guilty. If you think we're immune, think again. Try straying outside the acceptable boundaries of libertarian orthodoxy or of hate's liberty, oppression, moral foundation. We can start by working on us. I don't have time to talk about it today, but there's another book that many of you may wish to consider reading. It's called Unstable Majorities, Polarization, Party Sorting, and Political Stalemate by Stanford political scientist Morris Fiorina. Fiorina makes a compelling case, as have others, I might add, that it's not voters today who are polarized and sorted. Rather, it's the two major political parties. In a previous era, there was considerable overlap of the views of major party candidates and activists. The political middle crossed party boundaries. This fact was often used to explain how two-party systems could continue to function. Many of us have involved in alternative party politics are hoping and praying that this sorting will cause one or more of the major parties to implode. Personally, I'm skeptical. Party loyalists, those 10% of voters who make up elected officials, activists, and donors, are already so well dug into their trenches, and they'll be firing across no man's land for some time to come. We might watch for things to heat up in Texas even in 2018. The good news, no, to this bad news, is that the duopoly parties are leaving the middle open. This is the opportunity, but one that libertarians will need to embrace if we are to succeed. Here's my favorite quote from Fiorina, one that we should apply to ourselves as well as Democrats and Republicans. Those most psychologically involved in politics have the least accurate perceptions of the views held by their fellow citizens. It is especially disconcerting to learn that the members of the political class, you guys, who dominate politics in America, not only are unrepresentative of the country at large, but also have the most distorted view of the country. Gary Johnson was not a perfect candidate for president in 2016. But I'm a follower of that old dictum, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Fortunately for me, my wife also follows that dictum, otherwise she'd still be holding out for Matthew McConaughey. Gary was a credible candidate who had successfully been elected twice as governor of New Mexico. This gave him cred with the media and a public platform. But more important for our discussion today, I loved Gary's metaphor of that 6-lane highway down the middle. His appeals to the third of voters who call themselves independent and whose votes are up for grabs. The two major parties appeal to the independent swing voters to get elected and then abandon them when it comes time to govern. Believe me, voters already know they're insincere. Why do you think political dissatisfaction is so high? Those most receptive to my message in 2016 were those who weren't against oil and gas, but who thought something needed to be done at the Railroad Commission. I made little headway with knee-jerk oil and gas industry loyalists or knee-jerk anti-frackers. What if the libertarian message to the middle actually was sincere? Personally, I agree with Gary. I think it already is. But we've got to learn to be better elephant whisperers. Even putting aside the question of winning elections, I believe libertarians have the opportunity to become a politically relevant force in Texas and U.S. politics. But given the entrenched, institutionalized advantage of the duopoly parties, this will not be an easy task. But it's not going to happen by keeping on, and certainly not by doubling down on what we've done in the past. I'll say that again. Political relevancy is not going to happen by keeping on, and not by doubling down on what we've done in the past. In a previous life, I used to work for a small oil and gas software company. The CEO would often ask me why our customers just didn't get it. What he meant was, why aren't they buying our software? I always told him the same thing. He wasn't asking the right question. The right question was, why didn't we get our customers? He didn't listen. The company's no longer in business. My advice to libertarians is the same. Listen to voters. It's no secret that the political world is increasingly made up of autocorrection deficient echo chambers. I believe that where we libertarians go astray is by failing to adequately address issues related to community moralities. We've got to get unstuck from our own propensity for binary thinking and broaden our political messaging beyond the Liberty Oppression Foundation. Libertarians, to our credit, put a great deal of emphasis on the non-aggression principle, often cited as embracing three things we learned as children. Don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, keep your promises. The other day, it dawned on me why the nap always left me wanting. I realize it's because there were other things we also were taught as children, and which most of us also taught our own children. The nap isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. What about play fair? Be kind. Don't call names. Share your things. Help each other. Clean up your mess. Respect your elders. These are messages of community that we forget, much to our political detriment. The takeaway from Haidt's book is that we must embrace true conversation with others. But we've got to remember that conversation is not one way. If we expect others to change their minds, we must start by being open to changing ours. Let's work on that moral divide by trying to better understand those who disagree with us, not ridicule and disparage them. Let's refuse to be drawn into the drama of those who insist on bad behavior. Let's decrease our use of code words and memes and rational arguments that only seek to reinforce our point of view or that of our tribe. Let's acknowledge that there are real moral issues and that those that disagree with us might just have a point. Let's acknowledge that we're real human beings who just might not have all the answers. Let's cut ourselves and others a little slack. Let's seek out those with similar attitudes, regardless of their political persuasion, who are willing to engage with us in real person-to-person conversation. Let's start down the path of learning how to be effective elephant whisperers. If we stay stuck in the Liberty Oppression Foundation, we will remain in the wilderness. Though our message will continue to resonate with fellow libertarians, we will fail to reach out to those swayable, independent swing voters who might actually like our view of the future. Unless we find a way to have conversations with everyone's elephants, with all their different moral positions, we'll be doomed to remain forever in Groundhog Day. You'll recall that the film's protagonist, Phil Connors, had to change in order to extricate himself from the torture of repetition. That's our challenge. Thank you.
All right, we're going to do some more Q&A. Who would like to ask the first question?
Hi, Dr. Miller. Thank you. I want to ask, do you think that, well, you rightly point out that the duopoly is really the main problem and that we need to focus on overcoming. Do you think that that will become possible with a change of laws, or is it just a reality of game theory that people will always gravitate toward and arrange themselves to one of two?
There's a lot of political science about why our system ends up with a two-party system. When you have more parties, what's really interesting actually about Fiorina's book, when you have more parties as they do in parliamentary systems in Europe, you tend to get parties that are more focused, very narrow issues. And what's really interesting about what's happening today is that our two parties are becoming more polarized. The European parties are doing the opposite, which is sort of counter to what the political scientists believe happened. So I don't know the answer to that question. I think we're in the midst, and that's why I think Fiorina's book is so important. We're in the midst of some kind of a transition. He likens it to the way things were at the end of the 19th century in the U.S. And frankly, he doesn't know how it's going to end up either. He even analyzes the Trump election in the last chapter of his book. And he says, look, it's open because the Trump election isn't over. So I don't know. What I do know is it's really hard if we don't change some of the laws. If we don't manage to make it easier to do petition drives, if we don't manage to make the threshold to retain ballot access something more reasonable than 5%, it's going to be really tough. I am worried about 2020. I'm not worried about 2018 because I think Mark Ash's race will get us to the 5%. 2020, though, we'll be back in the situation where the only statewide races will be railroad commissioner and judicial races. And if it's still 5% and the Democrats run everybody, we'll have the same problem we had in 2016.
Next question.
Mark, do you have any specific suggestions on what we can do maybe at the local level or a state level to implement some of these ideas of speaking to the elephant and trying to find the middle ground? And this is almost a side topic. Also finding a way to come together more, even though we may have differences within the libertarian movement. So speak to specific ways on how we can do those things.
You know, I don't have very many. I'm hoping to stimulate a creative thinking among the rest of you. I really liked Jason Rink's message, which was very similar to mine, which is to understand the people you're talking to, right? And that was my experience when I ran for railroad commissioner, was doing a lot of listening. I had the experience that if I had been able to talk to every voter in Texas, I could have convinced them that I should have been their railroad commissioner. And I think that's true. But how do you talk to every voter in Texas? Not very easily. So it really is a very difficult task. I would suggest get involved in a lot of different things. Go to some environmental groups. Go talk to people that even might be totally different than you, and you'll get the experience. You'll get the reaction that Jason said, which was, "I know who you libertarians are," because I used to get that reaction too. You just want to let all the big corporations do whatever they want, right? That's something I would hear, and my campaign supporters would say, "No, wait, you got to listen to him. That's not what he's saying at all." So just engage and listen, have conversations.
Last question.
So Mark, building on a couple of things you said, what I'd like to understand, in 2020, there's no straight party voting anymore. What's it actually take, in your view, resource-wise, to win a down-ballot race? And how do you answer the throwaway vote question well enough to get past first base?
Yeah, the throwaway vote question, the problem with the throwaway vote question is there are some really good arguments as to why voting for a third party is not a throwaway vote. Gary Johnson had some of those answers. I had some of those answers. People don't believe you. So this is the post hoc reasoning thing. You can tell them till they're blue in the face, but they're convinced my vote is about winning, right? And so if you're convinced your vote is about winning or losing, that binary thinking, you're not going to throw away your vote on a third party unless you think there's some other reason to vote for a third party. Now, we'll start doing better when we get to electing people, but I think our first goal, if we can get there, is to convince people that even if an alternative party gets 10% of the vote, it makes all the difference in the world. The press will cover us, people will know about us, things will change. But I really don't know how you get around that wasted vote thing. It's a tough one. But what I'm suggesting is rational arguments aren't going to work. You got to find some way to appeal to something else And it depends on who you're talking to as to what might work for them. But I don't know. Approval voting is probably not going to happen anytime soon in Texas. But it would be a good idea.
Dr. Mark Miller, everyone.